Good evening, everyone. Thank you again for tuning in today. My name is Spencer Ruckty. I'm the author events manager here at Third Place Books in Seattle, Washington. On behalf of the bookstore and our good friends at Hugo House, which is Seattle's historic nonprofit for writers, I'm very pleased to say hello to Matt Bell. He's here to talk about his new craft book, Refuse to Be Done: How to Write and Rewrite a Novel in 3 Drafts. First of all, if you haven't already, go ahead and use the chat window to say hello to us. We'd love to hear from you. And while you're doing that, I just want to thank again our friends at Hugo House. Events like these are their bread and butter, and we're very happy to be partnering with them today. You can check out their full events calendar, which I will link to in the chat later. Next week on May 4th, they have New Yorker writer Catherine Schultz, author of the memoir Lost and Found, live at Hugo House if you're in town. Speaking of, the chat is open during the course of this lecture, and we encourage you to use it respectfully. Tonight, we'll also have some time for your questions. So if you have questions about writing, the process, what craft beer scene is like in Phoenix, Matt can answer all of those questions for you. Please submit those to the Q&A window at the bottom of your screen, which is separate from the chat window. We also offer closed captioning for those who are interested. You can just hit the live transcript button at the bottom of your window to turn this feature on or off. A reminder that if for some reason you have to duck out tonight in the middle of the session or you missed something, this lecture is being recorded and we will be sending it to you directly to review once we get it posted privately to our YouTube page. All of your tickets include a copy of Refuse to Be Done en route to your address, and those should be arriving soon. Except for Barbara and Eric, I believe you just purchased your tickets recently. So though I will be sending those out right as we get off tonight. And now, without further ado, a brief introduction to our lecture this evening. Matt Bell is the author most recently of the novels Appleseed, Scrapper, and In the House Upon the Dirt, Between the Lake and the Woods, which was a finalist for the Young Lions Fiction Award. Matt teaches creative writing at Arizona State University, and amongst his accomplishments, he publishes a monthly Substack newsletter with reading recommendations and writing exercises, and he is an envious runner. I recommend following him on Twitter for beautiful pictures of landscapes from his runs and also early sunrises. Without further ado, let's all talk about writing. Please welcome Matt Bell.
Thank you so much, Spencer. It's so good to be here. So good to be with everybody in the audience. It's always a little odd in these webinar things, I can't see you. And so I just want to please encourage you to feel free to use the chat the entire time I'm talking. I'm going to say it again in 2 seconds as I move into my PowerPoint in the lecture. But the lively chat makes me feel like I'm not just talking to myself. So if I say something that's interesting or you have something to add to what I'm talking about, I hope you will. Please feel free. So yeah, thank you so much for being here. Thanks again to Spencer and Third Place Books. Thanks to Hugo House. I've had the good luck of being at Hugo House a couple of times to teach, and it's always a real pleasure to work with everyone in Seattle. So thank you for being here. I'm going to share a PowerPoint real quick. It'll take me just a second to get resettled. I'll do that, and then we will dive in. All right, you are, as I talk, you are welcome to put questions in the chat, even if it's about something I'm talking about right now. I can see it out of the corner of my eye. I teach on Zoom a lot. I'm really used to sort of reading the chat as I go. So please feel free, and I'll do my best to sort of elaborate on whatever you're asking. But let's dive in. Thank you so much for being here. We're going to go about 45, 50 minutes, and then I'll stop and just take pure questions. We'll cover the material we can cover as we go. We're going to talk today about the process of writing a novel as seen through the lens of revision and rewriting, really thinking about the kinds of rewriting and revision that you do at each stage of the novel, the way those actions sort of propel the task of novel writing. Most of the tactics I'll suggest today, I think, also apply to memoir and creative nonfiction and short stories, just probably at slightly different ways. But whatever you're writing, I think there'll be hopefully something here for you. And I also want to say that nothing that I'm going to suggest tonight is ever meant to be prescriptive or suggests that there's only one way to write a novel. Really, in some ways, what we're talking about tonight is the way that I write a novel, and hopefully it'll be sort of adaptable and useful to you in your process. But if something seems wrong or something seems undoable or just kind of like a bad idea, like please feel free to discard it, and I will appreciate that. Like I said, feel free to comment or ask questions as you go using the chat feature. If you do put questions in the Q&A, I will find those at the end, but I will see the chat as I'm talking. So I think that will be a good way to do it as we're sort of going along, but feel free to use either box and we'll make it work. So we're going to talk about novel writing through this sort of idea of like 3 drafts. And immediately in the book, I sort of take back 3 drafts and I say 3 stages, which is kind of really what I mean. But we're going to talk about them in these sort of this order. One is the first draft and the kind of revision it requires, which I think of as generative revision, the kind of revision that helps you complete the draft you're writing, helps you get through the book as you're making it. And the second draft I think of as narrative revision, where we're making the story and the plot and the structure the strongest it can be. And then we'll cover the third draft, which requires polishing revision, just really making the text the best it can be for your readers, whether that means people in your life that are reading your novel, it means an agent or an editor, but just kind of making that turn from the writer-based version to the writer-based version. Okay, so we're going to begin with the first draft, which, as I said, requires generative revision. A lot of the things in the book, a lot of things in this lecture really are versions of this thing that Lucy Corrin says. This is from her essay Material, which is in the Tin House Writer's Notebook, which is one of my favorite craft books. I can't recommend it enough. Lucy Corrin says, you should look at the material you produce to find your material. The story is always smarter than you. There will be patterns of theme, image, and idea that are much savvier and more complex than you could have come up with on your own. Become a student of your work in progress. Every aspect of a story has its own story. Some of what we're talking about tonight is really finding this, like the ways in which the book will teach us what it wants to be. So we're going to dive in right away into the first draft. What kind of first draft we should write. Personally, I think of the first draft as an exploratory draft, that I'm discovering the story by writing it. And in doing so, I'm also becoming a writer who's up to the task. A really common feeling when you're writing a novel is like, maybe I'm not good enough to write this novel. Maybe I'm not a good enough writer yet. Maybe I'm not smart enough. Maybe I don't know enough. But I really believe that you become the person who can write your book by writing it. And so we're going to talk about the ways you do that. I think a kind of important thing to remember is that the task of any given day of writing a novel is never to write a novel. It's very rare that you sit down and write 60,000 words in a given day. I certainly never have. I think mostly that's not the case, that you're going to make a novel out of these smaller efforts that you combine over time. And I think it's actually one of the gifts of writing is that it's a big thing that's made of smaller things. Because the task of writing a novel is so daunting, I don't know how many people are writing their first novel right now or here or trying to write a first novel. If you are writing your first novel, maybe that's a good thing to put in the chat. You can sort of claim that, like, I'm writing my first novel, which is exciting. I like sometimes to think about it in smaller sort of doses. If you write 500 words a day, 5 days a week for a year, you write 130,000 words, which is more than enough for a novel draft. You can see on the slide, my own published novels are actually quite a bit shorter than that. They take me more than a year, but also the idea like 2,500 words a week will get a novel done, like a very small amount goes pretty far. And then I also want to just say, if this is the first novel you've written, if you're writing your first book, you're here to sort of learn how to do that. I think writing a beginning, middle, and end, getting all the way to the end will do more for your future as a novelist than anything else you can do. Just knowing that you can type that number of words, knowing you can go the distance will make you feel confident in the future, even if the first book doesn't turn out to be like a first published book. I wrote 2 novels before I wrote my first published novel that I never really showed to anybody and kind of like stuck in a drawer and moved on. I love this. Claire says she's writing her second first novel. Carol says she's writing her third first novel. Soon John is writing her first novel. I'm writing what I hope will be my 4th published novel, and it still feels like a first novel. You're always learning to write the book that you're writing. So thanks for claiming that with me, everyone. Constance says, I have a memoir on this first novel. Rachel says, I finished a couple of passion project novels and working on a novel to publish now. It's great. We're all in this together, which is exciting. Thank you so much. Tamara, thank you. First novella. Absolutely. I love a good novella. So I kind of mentioned in the last slide about that I think of the novel as, or first draft of the novel as an exploratory draft. And one of the things for me is that I rarely outline. I rarely outline the first draft. I rarely start with knowing very much about it, in fact. But that can sometimes be a little anxious. It's good to have some direction where you're going. And I've become obsessed lately with these not outlines for getting started. One of these that I've been suggesting to my own novel writing students are these variations on what's called the log line. It's really kind of a screenwriting term more than a novelist term, but a log line is just a single sentence description of your book. And I'm just going to suggest these two, that if you can try to think about the novel you're writing in one of these two frameworks, it might be useful to you. One is a single sentence with an ironic twist. A classic example of that in movies is the movie Die Hard, one of my favorite Christmas movies, where a New York City cop goes to LA to visit his family on Christmas, only to find his wife's workplace overrun with terrorists. I feel that sort of unexpected half of the second part of that sentence. That's not like the plot of Die Hard, but it kind of suggests the plot. It tells you where you're going. And I think that's really useful. The second one is a single sentence that includes a character, a conflict, and a clock. That if you have these three elements, you know most of what you know sort of the framework of what you're doing. My example here is Cinderella has to get the prince to fall in love with her before midnight, or else her clothes will turn into rags. Like, that's not quite the plot of Cinderella at the party, but it gives you the character, what they want, and how long they have to get it. And those things do a lot for you when you're writing a novel. And then another version of this kind of not outline is a question central to the novel that each major character would answer differently. I would say I very rarely have this at the beginning, but I eventually discover it. My go-to example here is Game of Thrones. Like, who should be king of Westeros is an answer that all the families, all the characters answer differently. And when they get in a room together, there are different answers of what creates the conflict, which creates the drama of the story. So some answer, whether it's like, what is a good marriage? What does it mean to be a good person? Again, who should be king of Westeros? Like, these things sort of tell you how characters will differ as they come into the room together. And if you can just have something like this at the beginning, you probably have enough to get going. Some general tactics for the first draft. I'm a big believer in that your novel needs to have a title from day one, or as close to day one as possible. I don't know if anyone in the room, when I say this to a live audience, but there's always someone who looks super nervous, but some of you might have something called like novel 2.docx, this sort of kind of non-committal, like maybe I'm writing a novel kind of thing. But I think if you can give your novel a title, it makes it feel kind of like it's a real thing. You know, I'm writing a novel right now. My next novel right now is called Split and Sprawl. And it's been called that since I started. And sometimes, you know, having that title there makes me feel like the book already exists. I love this Kevin Brockmeyer quote you can see on the screen, where he says, I think of the title as the target toward which I fire the arrow of the story. That somehow this title tells you where you're going. It tells you what you're trying to do. It'll help you see some of the other dimensions of the book. My general experience has been like, I know the title on day one, or else I never feel like it's right. I think like name your novel the way you'd name a baby, like it'll grow into its title. One of the other tactics for first draft that I really love comes from the novelist Charlie Smith, and it's what he called writing the islands. And what he meant was, you write the scenes you can see now. You write the scenes that are in your mind that make you excited to write your novel. Like, most of us probably have something that we like. The reason we're writing the book is to write this scene. And Smith says you should write this scene like now. You should get it on the page, get it out of your mind. And there's maybe two reasons. One is the islands are exciting. They're like, you're following your excitement. They're the reason you want to be there. But I think once you get the best scene that you have in your head now on the page, you immediately start wanting to, your brain makes room for the next scene. So you get the best island you can see out, and then another one will appear. But if you never write the thing that you really want to write, you're sort of like always doing things that are secondary to it. So that's been really sort of useful. I'm just saying, and I'm sorry if I pronounced anybody's name wrong. Nakashi is sort of like using this name the book strategy. It's really, really great. I mean, I feel much better writing like a named book. So I'm glad that's been sort of useful. One of the other tactics for this draft is what I think of as thank you, as I think of as predictive writing. So you read what you've written and then you write what you predict. So it's somewhere in your early scenes, there's characters are noticing things, characters are interested in things, they're telling stories, they're sort of showing what they think about the world, and you're also setting up sort of themes and you're foreshadowing future events. I'm a wild foreshadow in the first draft. I foreshadow constantly. I'm like, I don't even know what this is foreshadowing, but I'm just putting in foreshadowing so that I'll have something to write later. And I practice this on published books. When I'm reading a novel, I'll stop after a chapter and be like, what is this chapter setting up for the future? What is this chapter making necessary? I'm trying to sort of learn how the early chapters of a book make the next chapters necessary. And I think you can practice that in your own books. Just by looking at what you've already written, you can sometimes discover what to write next. And I think that's something that I'm doing constantly in a first draft. I'm also a big researcher. I really love novel research. One of the reasons I like to write novels is to think about something for 3 to 5 years. But I have this rule that's been really useful for me, which is I don't take notes when I research. It's really easy to like only research and not write a novel. Maybe some of you are feeling like quietly guilty about this right now. There's always people who feel like they're researching when they should be writing. And so my rule is, when I'm reading a book for research and I find something I want to use in my novel, rather than write it down and make it kind of that nonfiction prose, I use it as a generative prompt. I only let myself write something down if I write it down in the novel. I give it to a character to say in dialogue. I use it to propel a scene. I use it as descriptive material. So that way your research is always generating new prose as opposed to being this separate document that you're creating. I love novel research. The bookshelf you can see behind me that I've sort of covered up with these front-facing books is actually my novel research shelf. That I fill that shelf every time I write a book, and then I box everything up and I put it away, and then I fill it again for the next book. I do a lot of research, but this is how I keep it from overwhelming me. And then these two ideas that are very similar. One is from George Saunders. Saunders talks about this in his interview at the magazine Bomb. If you look up George Saunders Bomb, you can find a longer, probably smarter than I'm about to say it, description of this. And Saunders says that your task in the first draft is to steer your characters toward the rapids, which just means that our natural inclination sometimes is to keep our characters out of trouble. And the way we try to keep ourselves out of trouble, we don't want them to like people to be mad at them. We don't want them to do the thing they're not supposed to do. We don't want them to get jammed up in life because we like them. And Saunders, like, you have to put your characters in trouble because trouble is what creates the story. And Charles Baxter's idea, which is from his book, The Art of the Scene, is similar, that you make a scene in your novel by causing a scene. You were probably taught, as I was taught, things like don't make a scene when you were a kid, when you were acting out. But that's some of what works in novels. I look at my own drafts for things like she almost said, he almost said, they thought about saying but didn't say, I wanted to do but didn't do it. And then I try to like make them do those things. The character who says the thing that no one else will say is a person who causes scenes, and they make action happen in the novel. And you probably want that. The way the politeness we use in real life is not actually that good for fiction most of the time. Yeah, Barbara's thing, think of the worst thing you could do to your character, now make it worse. Yeah, it's not all like the misery parade for your characters, but there is a little bit of like putting them in the fire and seeing who they become, which makes novel drafts go early on. Related to this is, I think, like, I don't always know a lot about my characters when I start out. My second novel, for instance, I didn't know the character's name. I didn't really know what they cared about. I knew what they did, like I knew what their occupation was, and I was trying to like discover them just by writing them. I'm gonna come back to that in a minute. I love this quote from Claire Ray Watkins where she says, you need to know the story the characters are telling themselves, and then beyond that, you have to know the stories your characters are telling themselves about the stories they tell themselves. We all have like a narrative that we tell other people about why we're the way we are, why we act the way we are, why we've chosen the professions we've chosen. We have some sort of self mythology that we have, your characters have one too. And finding a space for them to talk about that, find space for them to show that, will help you understand who they are. And I think there's like the story that they tell themselves, and there's how they got to that story. And in many ways, that's like all the backstory you need. You need to know those two things about a character. This is what I was talking about just a minute ago about not knowing my protagonist in that second novel. I had this rule for myself that I didn't really know who he was, but if I could keep him acting and I could keep him making choices, he would reveal himself to me. And I think that's true. Character actions and character choices create cause and effect, and they make the next scene necessary. When no one's making choices and no one's acting, then your book gets static in a certain way. I think this is especially true in the first person. If you're writing in the first person as you're discovering your novel, you end up with sometimes with like a camera protagonist, a character who's sort of looking and describing, and other people are acting, but the first person protagonist himself does not necessarily do very much. And so I think it's just something to sort of note or beware of. It's the real trap of the first person. The trap of the third person is false profundity, where you're making like big statements about life you haven't earned, but that's sort of a different issue than here. But try to keep your characters acting, try to keep them doing things, and they would tell you who they are. This is related in some ways to making scenes that are sort of complete. And I think one of the ways that scenes complete themselves is by the arrival of change, that a scene begins out of kind of a stasis of some kind, and then it ends when something's happened that's new or different. This could be the form of a discovery, a complication, a reversal, or a resolution. These are 4 terms come from Jeff Vandermeer's Wonder Book, which is another great craft book. And like in a detective novel, a detective wants to know something, they go into a scene, and the moment they find out the clue that gets them to another location, that's kind of the end of the scene. That's how you know when to go somewhere else. A complication is when a character thinks they're about to get a goal, and then it's more complicated than they think they are. The introduction of the complication creates change in the plot. Obviously, a reversal is when a character thinks they're winning and then they're losing, or vice versa. In a resolution or something sort of resolved. Excuse me. And then there's also like the flipping of a binary, which it can sometimes be like gross changes, like a character who is alive is now dead. A character who was not married is now married. Like that's the sort of end of the scene. You've all been to a wedding, and like the second the people are married, you're ready to go. The scene is over. So as soon as change has occurred, we can move to a new space. I also should say, I know this is like a ton of information coming at you really fast. That's sort of the mode. But 98% of this is in Refuse to Be Done, smarter than I'm saying it, and you're all about to get that. So if there is something that goes a little fast, I hope you'll review it in the video, but I also hope you'll have it in the book. So please forgive me for that. Inevitably, as you're writing your first draft, you will get stuck. I get stuck constantly. And one of the ways I get unstuck is to sort of give myself assignments inside the book. And I'm going to give you these 6 scenes to write if you're stuck in your novel. The first one comes from scenario planning. You know, an organization is just trying to imagine what might happen in the future. They sometimes do these scenario planning exercises where you imagine the good outcome, the bad outcome, and the weird outcome. So if you write 3 scenes in which something goes well for your protagonist, something goes bad for your protagonist, and something goes weird for your protagonist, you will sort of shake them from the stasis of your book in a way that's really pleasing. It may be obvious, but the weird one does a lot of work. It's always really nice to introduce some weirdness into a book that feels stuck in a certain way. And these next 3 scenes are all about your character's relationship to power, their own power, other people's power. And so you write these 3 scenes, a scene in which your protagonist does something to someone else, which means they're acting upon someone, a scene in which your protagonist does something for someone else, which means they act on their behalf, and then a scene in which your protagonist has something done to them, which means they're acted upon and then reacts. You know, in the last slide, we were talking about keeping your characters acting, keeping your characters making choices. These 3 scenes are kind of impossible to write without making choices and without making actions. And I think you'll find that if you are stuck in some way, if you write these scenes, you'll become unstuck, which is the goal, of course. And there's just some general revision tactics for the first draft. Before the day ends, find one thing to fix the next time you sit down to write. I try to write like 5 days a week. So days I'm writing the next day, I'll look at the novel before I go to bed. I actually usually do it on my like phone or my tablet, so that I can't really work, but I can sort of like glimpse at it. And as soon as I find one thing to fix, I stop reading. I'm just like trying to get myself to the desk easier the next day. I'm going to fix this sentence. I'm going to rewrite this opening of the scene. I'm going to fix this typo or missing punctuation, something that makes me like know what I'm doing when I sit down. Because sometimes that first like what now is the hardest part of getting writing. And so it speeds me up a little bit. And I think every day I try to revise a little bit. I kind of go back over like the last 3 pages I wrote and just make them a little better. So that you're constantly sort of like improving the materials you're going, you're remembering what you're writing, kind of that same like find your material by looking at your material. You do a little bit of that every day. If I get really stuck, I pick a bigger chunk and I retreat back. I go like 20 pages, 30 pages, and I just try to revise toward the sort of blank page, try to get there at a sprint because I'm in the work. And that can sometimes be really useful. And I think also at this phase to say, many of you are probably writers because you love language and you love sentences. You love the sound of sentences. Like that's the thing you really, really want to do. It's actually my favorite part of being a writer in some ways. But I also think you have to somehow find a way to not fixate to the point of paralysis. You have to find a way to write forward, knowing that you're going to have a chance to rewrite those sentences, knowing you're going to get to revise. I don't know if anyone else has this experience. I can't see your faces, so I can't see if you're recognizing it. But for me, when like the plot wheel's turning the hardest, when like a scene has to do a big plotty thing, my sentences like go just become terrible. I was using more colorful language. Let's say become terrible. They really stop working. They kind of fall apart on me. When I'm writing dialogue, I often feel like the sentences around the dialogue are really hard to keep well. And I think some of that is just like I can't do everything at once in a first draft. And I've learned to sort of forgive that a little bit. Like this is a scene where I'm figuring out the action. And it's okay that the prose isn't sparkling yet. This is a place where I'm figuring out how 2 different people are talking in 2 different voices. And it's okay that the action around that is not beautifully written. I think you have to find a way to forgive yourself. And what in the next slide, Jane Smiley is going to call like suspending judgment. That part of what you're doing in a first draft is suspending judgment of the thing you're making until you've made it all. As Jane Smiley says, there's a couple of Jane Smiley quotes in this. I've never met Jane Smiley. I'm a huge fan. I've also learned a ton about novel writing from listening to Jane Smiley talk about it. This is one of those moments. Smiley says, "You don't know what you're writing till it's done. So if a draft is 500 pages long, you have to suspend judgment for months. It takes effort to be good at suspending judgment, to give the images and story priority over ideas, but you keep going, casting about for the next sentence. I think there are 2 kinds of sentences in a rough draft, seeds and pebbles. If it's a pebble, it's the next sentence and it sits there. If it's a seed, it grows into something that becomes an important part of the life of the novel." This emphasis is mine. The problem is you can't know ahead of time whether a sentence will be a seed or a pebble or how important a seed it's going to be. This feels like the most exact description of what first draft writing feels to me that I know. Constance, that's amazing that you got to study under her. I mean, she just seems like the smartest person. I'm so envious of that. Okay, so one day we'll finish this first draft. My first drafts have taken wildly different amounts of time, but we're going to finish it. We have this. We're going to stop. We're going to celebrate. A bunch of you had finished like multiple drafts in the past. You've written multiple first novels. My own experience has been the first draft of the novel. I'm glad it's done. I feel proud of it. And I'm also kind of aware that it's not quite a book. And I always think about this Borges story on exactitude of science. I don't know if anyone knows this. No one I have talked to in this book tour in like 30 events has known this story. But it's like this 2-page Borges story about a kingdom of cartographers who are setting out to make like a perfect map of the kingdom. What they end up doing is they make a 1-to-1 map of the kingdom. So it's exactly the same size, which is of course not a very good map. And I think my own first drafts are often like a book-shaped map of the novel I'm trying to write. They're somehow the same length of the novel, but they're not quite the novel, which is why we're going to do a second draft. And at this point, I also always take a break. And I think you have to do 2 things. You need art time and live time, which just means you need to make something else and you need to do something else. And the whole point is to come back to the novel you're writing fresh when we begin the second draft. I think the real goal for me is to get to the point where I'm no longer thinking about the book every day. When I'm finishing a first draft, I'm consumed by it. I'm trying to become like unconsumed so I can come back at it with sort of fresh eyes. And we're gonna move into the second draft, which again, we talked about narrative vision. We'll talk about this in a minute. But I'll introduce it with this quote from Hilary Mantel, which I think is the moment between. And she says, I have to take a deep breath before I start the first full revision. I used to hate myself for procrastinating, but now I see it might be wise. You need to pause in holy fear of what you've done and make sure you don't wreck it in panic. So right now, we're going to pause in holy fear. I'm going to have a drink to refresh my voice, and then we'll begin the second draft. Thank you so much all for listening too. I know this is like so much information. I really appreciate your enthusiasm, and thank you for everybody in the chat. It makes me feel like I'm not talking to my own PowerPoint all night. So thank you. So when I begin the second draft, this is when I outline my own books. So I do outline, but I wait until I have a first draft, and then I reverse outline or map that first draft, and I write down everything that's happened in it. There's a lot of ways to do this. I think of this as like a narrative outline or a beat sheet, where I'm outlining the first draft to analyze what I made. And what I'm trying to outline here is the action that occurs during the time narrated. Eric, I'm so glad you know that Borges story. You're the only person. You get a prize of some kind. Thank you so much. It would be very Borges of me to have just invented that story, of course, and that it did not really exist. So I'm glad it does. So we're outlining the action that occurs during the time narrated, by which I mean the prime storyline of the novel, not the backstory, not the digressions, not the essayistic parts of the book, but whatever happens during the prime narrative. If you have multiple timelines, you might have to do this for each one, right? But like what happens during the main time. And what we're trying to do in this stage of the process is to study what Jim Shepard calls the rate of revelation, by which he says the sense we have of the pace of which we're learning crucial emotional information about the story's central figures. If you're writing a novel, as I often do, that has a lot of world building, that's also a kind of rate of revelation. Like we learn about the world as we go. And readers want to be kind of constantly learning new information and getting new revelations. So we're trying to figure that out. Once I have this outline, I start studying it and revising it to plan the second draft. So I'm analyzing the shape of the novel's plot as expressed in its structure. What's missing? What takes too long to happen? There's a long description of how to do this in the book. I'll just give some quick examples. If you're writing something that seems like it's kind of a 3-act structure, there's this moment at the end of Act 1. So an inciting incident starts the book, right? That's fiction. An inciting incident brings us into like something new. And in the first act of a 3-act structure, the character is often reacting to it. Something's changed in their world and they have to sort of deal with it. But there's a moment, which is usually the break between Act 1 and Act 2, where a character stops reacting and starts acting. They choose their story and then become driving the plot. This, in a first draft of a novel, in what I've seen in my own books and other people's books, it's often very like squishy. Like a character sort of like accidentally ends up in the second act. But I think a character really, really has to choose to do this. In Lord of the Rings, Frodo has all this stuff happen to him in the first book. And then at the Council of Rivendell, he chooses to take the ring to Mordor, and he becomes the hero of the books. That's the moment where it really becomes his story. And so you're looking for that moment where your character chooses to go forward. Even in like a very realist kind of psychological book, there's a moment where a character comes up with a plan and enacts it. We're looking for that moment. Most novels are driven by causality, with each next scene is made necessary by the one before. So as we're looking at this outline, we're studying the cause and effect chain of the novel. How does each scene make the next one necessary? Why does it have to sort of continue? Again, I'm trying to harp on this. In every scene, what changes? Sort of looking for the change that creates the next scene as we're going forward. I love this idea of Robert McKee's, which comes from his book Story, which is a screenwriting book, one of the great books about plot, and I can't recommend it enough. He says a story must not retreat to actions of lesser quality or magnitude, but move progressively forward to a final action beyond which the audience cannot imagine another. This is one of the things we're trying to do in this outline, is to plot a version of this book. And then also sort of remembering that the outline is like a scale model. It's just easier to move things. If you have a list of bullet points, it's really easy to move the bullet points. So you can be kind of brave and bold in this section. Trying to move chapters in your actual novel is very daunting. So we're doing it at this phase because it's easy to move things. It'll let you be a little more dramatic here. So this next slide, I'm gonna like this slide is an hour lecture, so we're not going to have that. I'm going to go over it really quickly, and I am going to tell you that I wrote an essay about this for my Substack, with Spencer talked at the beginning. It's mattbell.substack.com. It's like one ago, so if you look at the archives, you'll see it, talking about like how to do this. But what I'm suggesting is that you take the outline you have and you compare it to some kind of, it's a good place to screenshot maybe if you just want to have this, some kind of existing formulaic structure, whether that's the 3X structure of screenwriting, whether it's kind of Freytag's pyramid that a lot of us learn in creative writing classes, whether it's the serial of like Huckleberry Finn or The Road, or these other ways of sort of doing multiple storylines. And it's not to make your novel formulaic as much as it is to like see what might be missing in your novel, or see what might be misproportioned in your novel. My last novel, or that's not right, the novel I'm writing now, I use the 3X structure as described in Blake Snyder's Save the Cat, which is a screenwriting book. And I just like put my novel against it to try to figure out what I might be missing. It was really helpful for me. Yeah, and Eric, that Jane Allison book is fantastic. I think mostly we're not writing novels in the meander, spiral, explode way, but if you're doing something wild, I think that can be a good place. Yeah, and as Natasha says, like we in the second draft outline, where was this advice when I was miserable in high school AP writing class? I do this with my critical writing. I do this with my academic writing. I do this when I'm writing a book review. Like I have to discover and then structure. And so you and me are on the same page here. Nothing wrong with outlining at the beginning if that's you, but this has been the way to do it for me. So at some point I have this revised outline, and then I use the revised outline to rewrite the novel. And for me, this is one of the biggest tricks. It is sometimes the part that makes everyone gasp. If you gasp, feel free. The second draft for me is often like the real draft of the novel. It's the big draft of the novel. And what I do is I retype the book from scratch, writing the better book that I outlined and planned from the first draft. So I explore in the generative thing, I figure out what my novel is, what it wants to be, and then I make this best possible version of it in the outline, and then I rewrite it. I do not throw away my first draft, although I know writers who do, and I think that's bold, and I would like to maybe be that bold someday. But I use the first draft as a guide, stealing whatever I can from it, but I always retype. No cutting and pasting allowed for me, because cutting and pasting is not revision. My belief is that you will not retype a bad piece of prose, but you will cut and paste one. And so cutting and pasting kind of lets you not quite revise. The first time I ever did this, I had two monitors. I have two monitors at home right now. And I put my original draft on monitor to the right, where I'm gesturing over here, put my new empty document on the front computer. And then as I rewrote things, I deleted them from the original draft. And I thought about it as a diminishing draft, that one day, like the first draft would be empty and the second draft would be great. And something like that happened. Like it's sort of a really good tactic for me. And what I'm really trying to produce is what Amy Tan talked about in the interview. She said, only when I finish the book can I go back to the beginning and write in the voice of all that happened. I love that idea, the voice of all that happened. Like I know everything about the story now because I wrote it once and I did this outline and made it even better. And now I'm writing with that knowledge. So I wrote one draft to discover the book, and now I'm writing the book having discovered it, and I'm making the best possible version of the story. So again, we will, you again write the draft. For me, the first draft and second draft take almost exactly the same amount of time. So the first draft takes me 10 months, second draft takes me 10 months. They're very, very similar for me. Eventually we hit this third draft where now it's the story is plot complete, successfully plotted, successfully structured. It's readable, right? Like this for me is like the first time someone could read it. I don't usually show people anything here, but it could be read. Now the task is to make it the best it can be, and really making the turn from like the writer-based version toward the reader-based version. Even here, I think the task of revision is so daunting. The idea of like make the book good is too big of a task. In the same way that your task was never to write a novel in a day, your task now is never to like make a novel great in a day. So we're going to talk about like a layered approach, breaking the work of polishing the novel into like many individual activities. We're only going to be able to cover a few of them here, but like tons of this in the book. So if you haven't, when your book comes, there'll be tons of this for you. And really what I do is I do like individual things all the way through the book or all the way through a chapter, and so that the task is small enough that I can complete it occasionally. The first thing we're going to talk about is dialogue. I historically have felt like I'm like not a good dialogue writer. Dialogue is the thing that took me the longest to sort of learn. And so at some point I'll go through a draft and I'll only edit the dialogue. I'm going end to end, only editing the places the dialogue appears. And so that way we're sort of just improving this by itself. As I do this, I'm doing a couple of different things. I'm considering my balance of direct versus indirect versus summarized dialogue. If you're not familiar with those terms, they're pretty Googleable, and there also is some of it on the book. But basically, direct dialogue is what's in quotes. And direct dialogue is great for like drama, right? The things where like something is revealed often have to be revealed in direct dialogue. Indirect dialogue is sort of a squishy middle ground where it feels kind of like direct dialogue, but it's not necessarily exactly what was said. And then summarized dialogue is like, he told me where the car was parked. As you can hear from even what I said, summarized is great for like just information, things that aren't dramatic, but characters need to learn. And sort of kind of figuring this out. These three things are what makes those kind of things sort of go. Yeah, Sinjun, that's great. Like, yeah, I knew you meant. Yeah, Jane Austen is fantastic about these two things, right? Absolutely. Thank you so much for that. I'm also thinking about the ways in which not fictional conversation, all conversation is competition. I, of course, am talking at you all, and one of the things I'm hoping is that you will, the competition part here is that you will think like I'm an intelligent person who you're glad you paid a couple bucks to see talk, right? All conversation, we're trying to be funny, we're trying to be smart, we're trying to be sexy. There's something we want. Sometimes we want the other person just to do something. Like there's some kind of power play in conversation. So you're looking for places where that's dynamic, where power control shifts, as the conversation says. I think I have the upper hand, then suddenly you have the upper hand, and then I try to get it back. And like, we're looking for how it can't just be like one-sided. We don't in real life like being in a one-sided conversation. I'm also looking at the action around the dialogue. There's these sort of things that we tend to write when we're just trying to get through a dialogue scene, the sighs, the smiles, the shrugs, the winks, the nods. You may have your own particular thing your characters are always doing. My characters are shruggers and smilers for sure. I'm trying to put more interesting action in the place of those things. I'm trying to find something that people are doing with their hands as we go through the scene, so that there's not quite so much of this. There can be like hundreds of smiles in a novel draft of mine, and people are just like grinning at each other while they're talking. And usually that's not quite the right thing. So trying to find some better action there. Yeah, Bar, so much sighing, she sighed. Absolutely. Sort of overwhelmed by it. This is also the place where I start really working the prose style. You know, I said like a long time ago, like, don't worry about your sentences yet. And the second draft, I'm trying to write better sentences. And now I'm like putting pressure on them. One of the things I do is I go through my entire novel draft and I look at every verb in every sentence, and I try to replace the most obvious choices with more precise or interesting verbs. One of the things I found is when you put a great verb in a sentence, you can often cut like sentences that are around that sentence. They're like describing the bad verb. Like a great verb will stand on its own and be so evocative that you won't need this extra description. Sort of looking for those moments. I'm diminishing thought tags, thought, understood, knew, these kind of things. In most of the kind of fiction we write, in at least American fiction, in either the first person or in like a really close third person, it's obvious that a character is thinking, or it can be made obvious that a character is thinking, even if you don't use those sort of tags. So I'm often trying to get rid of them. I'm trying to like diminish the mediation between the prose and the reader. I'm trying to get the reader closer to the experience of the characters. And that's this next thing is the exact same idea. Diminishing looking or hearing verbs. Looked, watched, saw, heard, listened. Instead of saying she looked at the burning car, just describe the burning car. We know the character is looking at it. That's whose point of view we're in. Instead of saying they heard the sound of the gunshot, just describe the gunshot. That we can get rid of some of this sort of mediation between the two things. This will make your prose feel like much punchier. Tamara asked if I'm trying to reduce your word count. I mean, it's not the reason to do this, but it will absolutely reduce your word count. You will 100% make the book shorter while you're doing this. Everything we're doing in this phase will move your draft closer to what published books look like. Like I promise you, it will make the book shorter and it will feel really good in that way. And then also thinking about like your sentence paragraph lengths and constructions, the sort of syntax of your sentences. Most of us have kind of a default. We have some sentence kind of style or some paragraph length we really like, but what makes style feel dynamic is variety. So you want to try to vary those things. You want to try to break your defaults. Excuse me. I've been talking all day and my voice is wearing out a little bit. I think like for myself, I can say like I've never met a sentence that couldn't use like more commas. I like a really long sentence. My default is really long. In my first book, I think there's one sentence in the whole book that doesn't have a comma in it. Like I just all these long sentences. So looking now, I'm much more like a long sentence is punctuated by a short sentence. I'm looking for ways to sort of vary that. And I would say like that's something I would be trying to do in this phase. I want to leave some room for sentences, or for questions. So I'm going to go really quickly through a couple of things. Everything I'm going to talk about left is in the book, so you're not missing anything as I blow through a couple of slides here. One of the things I do at some point is I print off my draft and I get highlighters out and I highlight a couple of things. I'm going to skip the first two. Again, in the book, you won't miss anything. But I go through and I highlight the weakest sentence in every single paragraph of the book. And what I try to do is delete them all. I try to take all of them out. And it doesn't mean the prose isn't good. It's just finding the thing that's not as good as everything else. And what this does is it raises the overall quality of the book. And as Tamara just asked, it makes the book shorter. My last novel, Appleseed, has 2,500 paragraphs in the last draft of the book. At some point, I went through and I took out the 2,500 weakest sentences. And you can imagine how much that took out of the book and also how it left everything else better. It's wild how much this does. It's sort of like a really great way to condense and also put pressure on your prose in a really great way. And I'm going to skip a couple things here. Again, all in the book, you're not missing anything. And I'm just going to end with this very, very last thing on this slide, which is, I think when you've done everything you can possibly do, you've done everything you can imagine doing, before you send it out, before you send it to your agent, before you query agents, before you look for editors, maybe even before you send it to your friends, I just really, at the last thing you do before you let other people in your process, I hope you'll read the book aloud, cover to cover. At this stage, it's really hard to read your prose on the screen. It's really hard not to skim your book. But if you read the book aloud, you will find some things to fix, of course. But what you're really doing is you're giving yourself the experience of the book you wrote at its best version that you could make by yourself. And I really think it's really moving, and I think it's really important for you to get to experience your novel. By reading it aloud, you make it bodily. You'll speak it with your mouth, you hear it with your ears. It'll be something you experienced. And it's like a gift you can give yourself before you let other people decide if it's good, if it's publishable, if it should win an award. Like, just let yourself have the sort of experience of your book. I think it's really important. I said there were more Jane Smiley quotes in here. This Jane Smiley quote, I would like tattoo on my body, memento style, if it wasn't so long. Jane Smiley says, I believe that you either love the work or the rewards. Life is a lot easier if you love the work. Everything I've talked about tonight, everything that's in Refuse to Be Done is, of course, work. It's effort. It requires you to sort of do all these things. I hope it's also fun, but I really think for me, the focus is on like what the work produces in me as a storyteller, what produces in me as a thinker, what it helps me sort of feel as a person. And these are all ways of getting you both to your ideal version of your novel and also to like a powerful sort of experience you can have for yourself. I'm going to shut off the PowerPoint and we'll take questions. I'm just going to leave this really quickly. If you want to screenshot this, you want to stay in touch. I have a craft newsletter where I write craft essays every month. I'd love for you to join me. And of course, I hope you'll say hi on social media and we can stay in touch in other ways. But I'm going to shut the PowerPoint off, start taking questions. You can put them in the chat, you can put them in the Q&A box, whatever makes you happy. I will be able to sort of switch between the two. Thank you so much for listening to this extraordinary amount of information. Oh, sorry, instead of stopping the screen share, I stopped myself. All right, I'm back. I know there's something in the Q&A, so I'm gonna go there first. But yeah, you can put these in either place you would like, and you will be great. Barbara asked in the Q&A, what happens if you're writing your contract or deadline? You don't have the luxury of taking the time you might want between drafts. Any suggestion? Yeah, that's like a totally different world, right? which I think is really complicated. You might have to sort of pick and choose. I wrote a short story this year that I was under contract for, and had to be a certain size by a certain date. And of course that put some pressure on me to sort of get done. The very, very last thing I did to get it under the word count I needed was the weakest sentence thing I just talked about. I thought there's no way I can possibly edit this anymore. There's no way I can do anything more to it. And then I remembered the weakest sentence thing, and I took the last words out, and I think made it a lot better. Deadlines are always tricky. I mostly have not sold my books before I wrote them. My second novel I sold when I was halfway done with it. It was the only time I've ever, kind of had that like halfway through the process thing. But yeah, I think that is definitely sort of tricky. You're just gonna have to prioritize, one of the things I love of my friends who were journalists before they were novelists is they have this very like time-oriented sort of ruthlessness that I sort of don't. I think I have a very open-ended process. But yeah, it's a great concern. Abby in the Q&A is asking, do you have a strategy when it comes to chapters? How necessary? Does a novel need chapters? When I was writing my first novel, when I first met my agent, my book was then in like really short chapters. And he was like, oh, you're so smart to put this in short chapters. The novel's really languagey. It's difficult for people. Short chapters will let them sort of rest. I said, oh yeah, in the last draft, there were no chapters. And it was just this 500-page like scroll of text. And he just put his head down on the table for a little bit and rested, because that was such a bad idea. I think the novel does need chapters a little bit, but they could be really different. There's a little bit of Refuse to Be Done about this. While I was writing the book, I did a little survey of chapter lengths, just looking at like new books that were around me. And they're all like kind of wildly different. There's lots of ways to chapter a book. I think if I was going to go for a default, like I was just like try to aim at something that's probably acceptable in an American novel in 2022, I might aim for like 10-page or less chapters. I think the 10-page chapter is sort of like really common. But there is no like one chaptering thing, Marlon James' last book has like a 20-page chapter and a 140-page chapter. Like they're sort of wildly different. So whatever you're doing can work. But I think if I didn't know what to do, I might aim for like the 10-page chapter. We can take a couple more questions if people have them. I obviously can't see your faces, so if you want to put them in the Q&A or you want to put them in the chat, I'll be happy to sort of do it. Sinjun asked if I'm on Strava for running. I am on Strava for running, so you can happily join me there and we can run together, which would be great, of course. Maybe I'll let Spencer start coming back on to wrap up. And if a question pops up before, Ezra asking, do you have any resource books you find using over and over? I have some favorite craft books for sure. I mentioned the Tin House Writer's Notebook books. I really deeply love those. They're really collections of essays that were lectures that were given at the Tin House Writers Workshop. I think they're fantastic. There's a book by a grammarian or linguistic professor named Virginia Tufte. The book is called Artful Syntax, Sentences Style. It's like an encyclopedia of how sentences work, sentence style, sentence parts. I think there's nothing else like it. It's not really a book you can read, but it's like really useful. I think if you're a person who loves language, there's no other book like that. I mentioned Robert McKee's Story. I don't know there's a great literary fiction book about plot. Like I don't know like if that exists. But McKee's book is really good. And it's definitely written in a like screenwriting seminar that you get in like a Holiday Inn in Burbank or something, but like it's really useful. And I think his ideas about plot are really smart. And I think that's good. Barbara asked, I'm drinking my Boulevardier. It's almost gone. We're doing great. Hard to drink and talk, but I'm making it happen. Thank you all so much. I'm going to turn it back over to Spencer, but really a lovely thing to get to spend an evening with you all. So thank you so much for putting up with me.
Yeah, thank you, Matt. Thank you for everyone for coming out tonight. It's so fun when people are active in the chat and like actually participating in these virtual events. Yeah, just a reminder, we have your copies of Refuse to Be Done are on their way. You should check out Matt's other books, especially Appleseed, which is a wonderful novel. Visit your local bookstores in 2 days on Independent Bookstore Day, wherever you are. They'll all be celebrating. They should all be doing something fun. And if not, just go, buy a stack of books for 10. That's all from me. Matt, any last words before we close
No,
out?
thank you all so much. Really, truly a pleasure to talk to you all. And Spencer, thanks again for having me, and thanks to Hugo House for organizing. It's really
Yes, absolutely.
virtually.
Yeah. Well, wonderful. Well, have a good evening. Go have a drink, and best of luck with your writing.
Thanks, everyone. Good night.